to go back in time a little bit, I caught the recording bug from a good friend of mine, and he at my local church, and so I started doing small radio show broadcast type stuff, and then church services themselves, and then just the whole concept of being in the studio and recording really intrigued me. So when after the 4 years in the Navy, I got out and I went to recording school and decided to go that route instead of a 4-year college. And then I went to school, and then my goal was to move to LA and get a job at some studio in Los Angeles. And fortunately, after I went to school and graduated, I got a job right away and started. My first studio was called Track Record. It's in North Hollywood. Building is still there. Studios are still there. Different owner now, and it's kind of more of like a private thing. It's not really a commercial facility anymore, which kind of stinks because I was thinking about it today. I was like, man, that room sounded really good. Worked my way as a runner for about 6 to 8 months, and then fortunately, one of the other assistants who was working there for quite a few years, he got in a fight with the studio manager, and he just, I quit. And the studio manager literally came down and was like, Darrell, get in the room. And that's how I started assisting. Um, and then, worked there for 2 years. Then I went to Conway for a year, which was a really good technical step. Lots of clients coming in with huge projects, back in the days of digital and tape, locking machines together, automation, mix notes, huge mix projects, huge tracking projects. So that was a great stepping stone. And then from there, I got a job at Ocean Way, which was kind of where I wanted to be at anyways, and started assisting there and engineering more and more gigs. And then finally, about 2003, I went independent. Easily, I mean, Radiohead was when I met Nigel Godrich and started working for him full time as his engineer. That was the big, like, oh, I've arrived. So he has the clout and the clientele to pull huge projects under his belt, and so it was an honor just to work with him. And quite frankly, I've learned a lot. I learned a lot from him. That is a crazy sensation when you work on something for weeks, days, months, whatever the scenario is, and then 6 months, 8 months, whatever it is later, you walk into a Starbucks or a coffee shop or something, and you hear, oh man, crap, I recorded that. Cool. It's really an insane thought process to have that happen, like or the amount of times I've walked into a grocery store and I've heard something I've recorded in a grocery store has been so many times. It's always hilarious. Usually it's Beck. Usually it's Beck that follows me. It is really cool because I was talking to somebody today about the aspect of, you're like, if you think about like, what's your legacy? And it's like, well, fortunately, my legacy is all online. You can Google me and figure out what I've worked on quickly, and then go to one of 20 streaming services and double click on like, oh wow, so this guy Darrell Thorp recorded this. Oh wow, that's cool. That's interesting. It's not kind of like somebody building a building at the same instant. Oh, so and so, but so and so built that building. Oh wow, cool. That it's amazing. It really is. It's really cool. But at the same time, I'm blessed. I know I'm blessed. My clients are amazing, and their talent level, and I'm just happy that they keep calling me. Quite frankly, like, oh, they've called me again. Okay, I'm doing something right. Cool. My thing with when I was working with Nigel, coming up as an American engineer, where for some reason there was just this sort of stigmata or unwritten rule of like when you started recording, you just did very, very little to the source and just put it on tape. And then later on, somebody became the mix engineer, and then they were given the decision of how to shape it into a direction. And I just never thought about that. And then to the point to where some people would brag about, like, I didn't do any EQ. I was like, oh, good for you. Okay, great. But then when I started working with Nigel, and then he would just go, and it was like, oh my God, it sounds huge and done. Like, just put it on a CD and drive it over to the radio station, put it on the air right now. There wasn't any thought process of like, oh, well, I get, somebody's going to mix this later on. It just wasn't, that's not how his thought process, it's like, get a direction, go with a sound, get sounds, start going for takes, making sure the sound is the right thing for the song, and keep going down that road. And then, but then if somebody goes, this isn't right, then okay, scrap it all and start over. And that was the thought process behind it. And then when I started thinking about it that way, I was like, man, that's musical. That is making art. And everybody has their own workflows, and that's completely fine. And I completely respect however you get from point A to point B. That's your decision to do that. But me personally, I like to carve something down a road. I'm not necessarily painting myself in a corner, so to speak, but I do want things to sound energetic and exciting. And it may not be done, but I'm hoping to get as close as I can with time frame that I have to get stuff sonically, sounding good. So he always worked on 24-track analog. He very, very, very rarely logged two machines together. It was always just one machine. And a lot of people were always like, well, Radiohead must be like 500 tracks. And it's like, no, dude, it's literally drums, bass, and a couple of guitars, and a couple of ambient things, and a couple of vocals, and then there's trickery done. Maybe there was a slave reel made because there's a stacks of vocals, and the vocals get summed down and then put back on, just a stereo pair on the, but it's usually just 24-track, and that's it. Yeah, because it just becomes about the parts themselves stack up to be literally something that just sounds big and huge. As engineers, we're part of, like, I made a comment to a couple of, like, an artist and a musician in the control room while we were working on a record, and I'm a terrible musician. Just don't ask me to play on your record. It's just not going to happen. You play guitar? Yes, but no. It's no. Next conversation. Who wants coffee? Let's change the subject. But but somebody, I said that because I'm always jealous of my friends who are insane musicians. They're just, but they're just stupid talented, number one, and they put in the time and the effort to become these insane players. Whereas instead of me playing my guitar for 12 hours a day, I was in a studio dorking around on a console for 12 hours a day. So somebody did say to me, he's like, you're playing an instrument right here, bro. The older I get, either it's a maturity thing, I'm not really sure, but I'm finding myself, the invention of a DAW, Pro Tools, Logic, whatever it is your instrument of choice is for recording. It seems that artists have gone in and they're recording themselves or with somebody, but it is an alternate moving template you can start a recording and then you record the drums or whatever, you program drums or whatever you want to do, and you put bass and blah, 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 and they start kind of shaping it into this thing. And then ultimately, by the time they say, well, I think I'm done with the song now. Now it's time to hire Darrell to mix. Okay, great, cool. So they bring me their song and I listen to it, and they've pretty carved it in a certain area. And then sometimes I have to ask them, like, why are you hiring me again? And they're like, oh, because we don't like what we're hearing. Okay. So do you want me to strip it all down and do my thing, or do you want me to take what you have and like fix? Maybe start with what we have and fix. Okay. Which saves me a lot of work because I'm not trying to replace stuff. But I've really learned that sometimes it's about just leaving everything that they have it as is, literally muting, and then, okay, let's open up the drums and listen to the drums. Well, the kick sounds like mush. There's no attack to it. It's tiny. The snare is just somebody didn't put a tea towel over it. They put a packing blanket over it. And so I just start from there and start repairing or replacing. And so that's a little bit more of my process lately, is where I used to just rip everything they had apart. And I realized that was a bad decision. So it's more about listening to the whole thing, or listening to, well, how do their drums sound? How does their bass sound? How do their guitars sound? How does their vocals, like that kind of thing. And then sort of figuring out what I need to fix and what I need to repair, or what I need to add to get to what I think is appropriate for the song, or what they're asking me to do for the song. I try to get the vocal in quickly. I've learned that mistake. I used to spend hours in turmoil over the music and then start trying to add in the vocal, and I realized that is such a bad way to work, because it is, you need that space right in the middle of the center image for your lead vocal or vocals, whatever the case may be, to cut. So even if it's a situation of I'm not necessarily paying attention to or working on the vocal quite yet, it is an instance of I need to hear it getting there so I can wrap stuff around it. No, when I started, we were very much in analog world. I started in 1997. It was pretty much all tape, all analog tape. And then, a few clients here and there would be digital 3348, so Sony 3348s. And so there's a few instances of that. And then once in a blue moon, the old dreaded ADAT machines would roll in, and I would go, oh, God, shoot me. And a little bit of D88, but it was pretty much all analog up until 2004, 2005, right when it really started. Tape became more and more of a huge cost, and hard drives were getting super cheap. Pro Tools was starting to become more and more of a stable platform. There were the few brave souls back then who were like, no, we can record on Pro Tools and it'll be fine. And then there was always the stories of like, well, we were in a take and then it crashed. Then we lost the take. And then they always said, that was the one. Yeah, I'm sure it was. Yeah. From going from tape, recording on tape and recording digitally, apple orange, whatever. But there's things now, because of working in the digital domain for so long, that when somebody says, hey, let's record on analog, my ear doesn't gravitate towards the analog sometimes, because of I'm so acclimated to working in digital and making it work to my advantage. There's just no noise floor to it. And so when I'm working on analog, it's always been a bit of a, especially the past couple of years where tape has been, you've only had a couple of options, and quite frankly, the options were not great until recently. A new brand came online, and it's, I'm using it right now, and oh, dude, it sounds good. So it's kind of refreshing to hear that a little bit. But the hard part for me, honestly, was a transition between mixing on a console and mixing in your DAW. That was a learning curve. The transover between analog and digital was analog, you can just hit it as hard as you want to and just keep going until it starts distorting, and then you're like, well, does it sound cool? Yeah, well then keep going. Does it sound cool? No. Well then back off a little bit and you'll be okay. Digital doesn't work that way. Digital, you hit 0 and you're hitting 0, which is what we were told. But then for some reason, like with the 64-bit mix engine that's in Pro Tools and in Logic, you can absolutely crush them and they do something that's really crazy. But at the same token, that's how most people mix on analog consoles. They weren't paying attention to headroom, they were just mixing. And then all of a sudden it was time, like, oh, well, it's time to print. You look over at your half-inch machine sitting over there and the needles were on, which you can't do. So you just grab your master fader and go, oh, all right, that's good, print. And that's what we did. But you were crushing the mix bus, and that was part of the sound. And so in digital, I was always trying to stay away from 0, the dreaded 0. And until someone sort of explained it to me, where I think I've had conversations with friends of mine about it, fellow colleagues, and and it was just realized, like, oh no, you just hit it and turn it down. It'll be fine. And that's when I realized, like, oh my gosh, they're right. You hit the mix bus as hard as you want until it's like, same thing. Does it sound good? Yes, but maybe it's a little bit too much. Well, then turn down a smidge and you'll be fine. So that was, once I kind of grasped that concept of the digital mix bus versus, and I had an instance where I was working in here where my clients were kind of adamant about trying to be like a hybrid, working in Pro Tools but mixing on the console, toned out faders, and then we had to do, and then months and months went by, and then they decided to do like this major arrangement edit, and so. And the edit was so that it was a mix recall to do the edit, not a just stereo. So, okay, cool, come by guys, blah, blah, blah. And then I go to flip on the console and the power supply blew up. And they were on a deadline. So I was like, okay. So I put it all in the box and A/B'd it and went, sounds great. Print. It's just like, sorry, API, you're beautiful and I love you, but okay. And that was another thing that really sealed it for me. Like, oh, you don't, and everything's different. Every situation is different. Sometimes it's nice to be hitting something electronics, and sometimes it's not. Someone told me about Drum Leveler and what it did, and I was kind of like, okay, that sounds interesting. Especially working with, when you're spoiled, fortunate LA engineer like I am, and most of my clients are either amazing musicians or they're roll call of guys are incredible musicians. You generally don't have to do much but just stick mics in front of them and press record and hope Pro Tools doesn't crash. But then you get up and coming bands or artists or whatever the situation may be, and it's just like the musicianship just isn't at the same caliber, and that's totally fine and fair, and so there's ways around. But when somebody was telling me about Drum Leveler, because so many instances of just an inexperienced drummer who hasn't been in the studio that much, can't hit his snare with the same velocity or sweet spot of the instrument every time. And that becomes a huge, and they used to just use compression to do that. We just compress the snot out of it to get it to sort of sit in the mix. And so when I started realizing that, oh, wow, drum leveler like just can make it all the same velocity and hit, and then, but oh crap, I can take the gate and turn the hi-hat, because the guy's just like beating the snot out of his hi-hat with his right hand, and I'm EQing the snot out of the snare top mic just to get any sort of tone out of the drum, which he's also, so that was just like a game changer. Like, oh my gosh, where has this plugin been literally all my career, in that aspect. So it was that, and so I immediately started using drum leveler right away. But then someone mentioned as well, like, oh, try out SurferEQ. And I was like, okay, cool. And I think I asked somebody, like, what's the best kind of like, oh, bass, you got to do it on bass. And then sure enough, because there's so many times where it's not necessarily the fault of, it's just the instrument themselves, the bass instrument, should I say, might sound amazing in the lower register, but then as soon as it gets up in the higher register, it just starts to get volume-wise incredibly loud. That's usually what happens. The instrument or the intonation, could be the player. I'm not really sure what the situation is, but you get it down. You know, they're playing on the low E and it sounds great and blah, 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 and all of a sudden they do a fill and it goes up to 12th fret and the thing just jumps out at 10 dB out of your mix. And you're like, what just happened? So there's, so then rather than, and it never sounds quite right when you automate it. It changes. So that's when I started playing with SurferEQ. In that instance, when the bass would change octaves and it would follow it up and it would just tone it down a couple dB for me and just do the job. So that was my second instance of it. Oh gosh, buy 47 tubes. Huh. Right? Absolutely. Buy 1073s, buy 47 tubes, buy real estate, and buy Fairchilds. Don't buy tape machines. What else? 1073s. Buy every 1073 you get your hands on. Yeah, that's what I would have told myself.